All right, wrestling fans, Wrestler Weekly Conversations, Episode 5, with a guest that I'm super excited to have, my friend Kevin Knight from IWF Wrestling here in the Great Garden State of New Jersey. We are going to talk today wrestling in the Northeast. So for those of you WWF, AWA, NWA fans from the 80s, we're going to talk a lot of really cool stuff, and some of you WCW fans. So, Kevin, thanks for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Mike. I'm excited. I've been looking forward to it, and we're going to talk some old school wrestling.
So let's start with, how did you get involved with going to these shows? When did you first start attending? Because you've attended a lot of shows at the Meadowlands. Right?
Sure. I was very lucky. As a kid, my father worked for PSE&G, which is the main gas and electric company here in New Jersey, and his title was Vice President of Community Affairs. PSE&G owned one of the luxury boxes at the Meadowlands Arena, which then became the Continental Airlines Arena, then the Izod Center, and now it's just sitting there doing nothing.
Yes.
So the luxury box that PSE&G owned, since my father was vice president of community relations and public affairs, he was in charge of distributing the tickets that would go to the employees at the company and entertain their guests and clients. So he would manage the luxury box.
Very cool.
So family members got to go and see whatever event we wanted to go and see. So if it was basketball, he would take my sister along. If it was an ice show, my mother would go with him.
I remember one of the ice shows back in the day.
I still love going to ice shows. Any live entertainment event, I still enjoy. So when it was wrestling or hockey or basketball, my brother and I would go. Okay. So I guess it was around middle of 1984 when I developed my love of professional wrestling, when I got swept up in the craze known as Hulkamania that apparently is still running wild. I went and fell in love with wrestling, and this was back in the time when the WWF ran once a month in every major arena across the country. And we were lucky enough that this was the time when Georgia Championship Wrestling, which was a part of the NWA, held their first show in the Meadowlands in 1984. Then it turned into Jim Crockett Promotions, and then that turned into Pro Wrestling USA with the AWA. Yeah. They would be there every other month. The WWF would be there every month. So it was almost like every 6 weeks there'd be live, less than more often than that, every 3 weeks. Wow. Between the WWF, Pro Wrestling USA, but then sometimes the AWA would do their own standalone show in addition to Pro Wrestling USA. So I was so lucky as a kid to get into these events with my father, and because he managed the luxury box, we got to go in early because he had to go in and order the food and beverages for all the clients and the high rollers and the big wigs and the corporate people. So I'd get to see them set up the ring and set up some of the lighting, or there weren't really stages back then, but they'd have the lights. Some spotlights were used, and I just developed a love for wrestling and seeing how all the behind the scenes stuff worked, and sometimes got to get autographs from the wrestlers who were hanging around ringside before they opened the doors to the general public. So
nice.
I kind of always had a little insider peek into wrestling before I got involved professionally in wrestling.
Very cool. And it's so funny because I was born around, in 1984, and I can remember by my first memories, it was wrestling. I was hooked, and I lived in Staten Island, so, heart of New York, all that stuff. And Hulkamania, like you said, we got swept up in it. What was it like when you saw Hulk Hogan live? What was the atmosphere like? Was Hulkamania, could you feel it like the way people talk about it?
Sure. I remember before Hulkamania took off, my older brother tried to get me into watching wrestling. Kevin, come on over, check this out. And I'd pass by the TV and I'd say, this is the stupidest thing I've ever. How old am I? I'm like 5 years old at the time. So I'm like, why are you watching this? This is so awful. It's corny. And then I'd, keep walking or do something else. And he would go to the events at the Meadowlands with my father. I'd be going to the circus and the devils and the nets and some of the concerts. Even at 6 years old, I'd be there at Hall & Oates or Journey.
Journey, that's a good one. I like Hall & Oates too.
So, they're still kicking ass.
Yeah, man.
So I had no interest in going to the wrestling events. And then on TV, I saw the first match that really got me hooked was Sergeant Slaughter Iron Sheik boot camp match in Madison Square Garden.
Classic.
I was supposed to be up in bed, and once a month, the live event from Madison Square Garden would be televised on the MSG network.
Yes.
So I'm supposed to be sleeping. I think my parents were out somewhere, so my brother and sister were down in the living room watching the show from the Garden. And I hear them screaming. So I get out of bed, I sit on the stairs, peek at the TV, and Iron Sheik and Sergeant Slaughter are beating the crap out of each other in a bull rope match. And I'm like, that match is real. These two hate each other. I hope this American guy kicks the Iranian guy's ass. My freedom's on the line in this match. And then I got hooked and then saw Hulk Hogan. So Hulkamania was running wild. I was in the Cobra Corps, Sergeant Slaughter. So those are the two guys that hooked me. And then Hulkamania, it was real. You could feel it. And then going to see him live at the Meadowlands, going to see Sergeant Slaughter live at the Meadowlands. When Hulk Hogan came out, it was an ovation unlike any other wrestler you've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I know Stone Cold was just some would say, even more popular than Hogan. But as far as an ovation goes and popularity, man, it has to be Hogan. I mean, because back then there was no special lighting, there were no entrance videos, there were no hype videos on a big screen before the guy came out to rile up the audience. It was Hogan, it was Eye of the Tiger, and the arena would shake. Wow. You could feel it when he came out. It was tangible. As Gorilla Monsoon used to say, Mean Gene, there was electricity in the air, and you could cut it with a knife, and it was real.
Absolutely. And I remember I saw him, and I was like, I want to be Hulk Hogan. Like, I loved everything about him. I loved his energy and his charisma. And I even heard Killer Kowalski in an interview, they talked about it, and he said that was Hogan's biggest thing, was his charisma, was that he had it like nobody else had it before him. And I think he was the first guy, not the first guy, but one of the guys that you could look at. Like, you don't necessarily need to be a quote-unquote great wrestler to be a great wrestler.
Well, I think the other thing that helped too, as far as it was the main reason that catapulted Hulkamania, was his appearance in Rocky III.
Yeah.
So as a kid, discovering wrestling, then seeing Hulk Hogan on TV, and then, every 6 hours, Rocky III was repeated on HBO.
Yeah.
And I remember watching, you'd be watching Rocky III, you'd see Hulk, and then, you'd put on wrestling, you'd see Hulk, and he was larger than life. Yeah. He was different than everybody else that was on the wrestling program, which is, now everybody kind of looks the same.
Yeah.
Back then, I mean, everybody did look, different back then. You had Hulk Hogan, you had Sergeant Slaughter, you had Junkyard Dog, you had Paul Orndorff, you had Roddy Piper, you had Cowboy Bob Orton, all guys with different looks. But Hogan just stood out amongst all those other guys, and then seeing how much bigger he was than Sylvester Stallone in Rocky III. I mean, Stallone is like 5'6", 5'7", and Hogan is a legit 6'4", 6'5", and just to see that size difference, he was larger than life when you saw him, in Rocky III, and larger than life when you saw him in wrestling. He just appeared like, he was like a god to us kids that grew up during the Hulkamania generation.
Well, and you take a look at that too. I read somebody made a great point. They said, how much did people believe? How much did Hogan and Vince and the WWF make people believe that even though you knew, they made you feel like WrestleMania 3 was the first time Hulk and Andre
sure
battled? And you bought it. You believed it, that this was his greatest challenge, that Andre was going to, if anybody could beat him, it's Andre the Giant,
Yeah.
And it was this. I mean, I know it wasn't really 93,000, 78,000 or whatever it was, but I mean, millions of people saw that across the world. That was a big deal.
It was the biggest thing ever. I remember, in school, kids, grammar school, were betting on who was going to win, Hogan or on. We had Mr. Maniscalco, who was the homeroom teacher, was also my math teacher. I remember you can't do this now in the schools. My God, there'd be an investigation. We bets on the chalkboard. There's the main chalkboard in the classrooms behind the teacher's desk, but then on the side there'd be like a secondary chalkboard.
Yep.
We had like odds. We were bets. It was like the sports books they have now in Atlantic City and the Meadowlands racetrack. It was like William Hill and DraftKings was going on, and we were taking bets on who was going to win, Hogan or Andre. It really was incredible, and it didn't matter that they ever wrestled before. I mean, for professional wrestling to be really successful, you need to cater to the mainstream everyday person. And it didn't matter if they wrestled before. So what that 3% of the hardcore fans knew that they wrestled. Doesn't matter. You got to be successful, you have to cater to the masses, and that's what they did.
And they did it better than anybody. I mean, they were so successful with that model for so long. And a couple of things that stuck out to me too from earlier what we had said. First of all, Mr. Maniscalco, what a Jersey name. I love that.
Absolutely.
I'm glad that we're representing
an Italian in New Jersey? That's odd. Go figure.
But we mentioned Sergeant Slaughter, and I think Sergeant Slaughter kind of got hot, wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. It didn't seem like there was, not that there wasn't enough room, but like Sarge jumps to the AWA, and I always thought it was a mistake not to put the belt on him there. But that's just me. What are your thoughts on the Sarge? Could the Sarge have been like an Intercontinental Champion, or could the Sarge have gone off to the AWA? Like, did he merit? Was he that over to be, you can be the top guy?
Well, he headlined Madison Square Garden 3 months in a row in the main event against the Iron Sheik. And I don't think Hulk was on any of those cards. It was April, May, and June 1984. The first match ended in a disqualification. The return match, the other guy got disqualified, and they brought it back third month, settle it in the no-holds-barred boot camp match, no referee in the ring, until the one man could no longer continue, which was the match that got me hooked. So he sold out the Garden 3 months in a row, and even though you could say he was the number 2 guy behind Hulk, you could have Sergeant Slaughter in 1984 in the main event headlining and selling out one arena, while Hulk on the same night would be in a different arena selling out against Hulk. Then was feuding with Dr. D. David Schultz, Big John Studd, Paul Orndorff. So you could have 2 sellouts in 2 major arenas, or close to sellouts, on the same night. So I think it was great that he was there at the time, and I guess he and Vince McMahon had the falling out in late 1984 over Sarge wanting to do the G.I. Joe tie-in. They were going to do a Sergeant Slaughter action figure.
Yes.
But Vince couldn't have one of his guys working with G.I. Joe because the company that produced the G.I. Joe toys would have been a conflict of interest with LJN, who was doing the WWF action figures. That's why Sarge left or was fired or whatever the case may be, which was in December 84. So just that month before, Sergeant Slaughter was wrestling at the Meadowlands. It was Sergeant Slaughter and Andre the Giant against Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik, October 1984 at the Meadowlands. That match is on YouTube.
Awesome.
2 months later, he leaves the WWF. February 1985, he's in the main event of the Pro Wrestling USA show at the Meadowlands.
That's awesome.
So 3 months later, there he is. I don't know why they didn't make him the AWA Heavyweight Champion. I think at that time it was Rick Martel at the beginning of 85.
Yeah.
Because at the end of 85, Rick Martel lost to Stan Hansen at the Meadowlands, actually.
He did.
The AWA title changed hands.
Brazos Valley backbreaker.
Yeah. That was the event where, it's on YouTube also, where Stan Hansen was interviewed in the ring after he won the title by Gary Michael Capetta. And Hansen slammed the microphone and chipped Gary Capetta's tooth with the microphone. But they created like some weird title.
The America's
title. That was it.
Basically Vern's old AWA championship belt.
So I guess that was supposed to be like their intercontinental level title or their U.S. heavyweight championship level. So he was the America's champion, and then I remember he feuded with like Larry Zbyszko and Boris Zukov over that.
Kind of disappeared after that.
Don't know why they didn't make him the AWA heavyweight champion.
Yeah,
not sure.
Maybe it was just bad timing. I know Vern liked wrestlers, like guys who could mat wrestle as his champion.
But Sarge was legit. He was a legit military man.
Yeah.
So
and he was over.
Sure.
And with the ESPN, but maybe they felt that the exposure of having Sarge on the show. And, I don't know what kind of draw Martel was as the champion, but, obviously it was doing something for them if they didn't,
he was their champion for about a year.
He
wrestled, I think, that event that I just mentioned where Slaughter, his first night at Pro Wrestling USA with the AWA and NWA in the Meadowlands, I think Martel wrestled Jimmy Garvin that night, who he was feuding with.
Was that the night that Slaughter wrestled Ric Flair?
That was later on.
Okay.
Slaughter was in a tag team battle royal.
Oh, yeah.
And his partner, Jerry Blackwell, couldn't wrestle that night. I don't know if he was hurt.
Battle royal?
By himself.
Yeah.
It was a tag team battle royal. He won by himself.
Yeah.
And then I think it was the next month he wrestled Ric Flair.
Okay.
And then he was in the feud with Kamala.
Yeah. And it's so funny. I love seeing the videos of those old Pro Wrestling USA shows. So for those of you fans who might not be familiar with Pro Wrestling USA, it was a joint venture between the AWA and NWA to try to compete with the WWF. So tell us a little bit about your experience with Pro Wrestling USA. Some super cards that came out of that.
Yeah, they even had for a short time, was it Continental in Tennessee?
Yeah.
Where was Continental Wrestling?
Continental was that Memphis? Or was that Alabama?
ICW was the Pafos in Memphis. Continental, I think Alabama.
Was
that the Fullers?
Yeah. That was the Fullers,
okay.
That's Alabama.
So they were involved in Pro Wrestling USA a little bit, and briefly so were the Von Erichs in World Class.
Okay.
But I don't think at any of the Pro Wrestling USA shows in the Northeast the Texas guys came up.
No, the only show I remember any of them being on was the Super Clash card, where Kerry wrestled Garvin.
You know what? It was Continental, and what was Jerry Jarrett?
Jerry Jarrett.
I know it was Memphis.
They were the CWA.
Okay.
CWA.
They were involved, and Continental, and some of those guys would be on Pro Wrestling USA because you would have Austin Idol and Jerry Lawler.
They had the shows that their first big events were at the Mid-South Coliseum.
So what I thought was cool was not only every month could I go to the Meadowlands and watch the WWF stars live and in person, the stars that I saw on NWA, World Championship Wrestling, Saturday night at 6:05.
TBS.
And then the stars I got to see on AWA, which was on 4 o'clock weekday afternoons, coming home from school, would be on ESPN. And then the stars from Memphis and Continental that I would read about in the magazines, Austin Idol, Jerry Lawler, you got to see them live too. So it was the best of both worlds, to see them live. And it was a little bit different where, back then the live events were pretty much straight up wrestling. The show business aspect, or some might say the cartoon aspect that you saw on WWF television, wasn't really infiltrated so much in the live events. It was pretty much 9 matches, straight up wrestling for 2.5 hours. No interviews, nobody on the microphone, no music videos, So the live events were kind of the same. It was just the talent that was different. And sometimes the style of wrestling was different too, because at Pro Wrestling USA, you would see some more hard-hitting action, which is what the NWA was. Yeah. So you'd have Tully Blanchard against Ronnie Garvin at the Meadowlands. They'd beat the crap out of each other for 20 minutes. Yeah. Where at the WWF event, they weren't really beating the hell out of each other so much. So it was cool to see the different styles.
Yeah.
mixed in live and in person.
And we had a lot of really great wrestling on TV. You mentioned the AWA. World Class would be on ESPN. We had the WWF, which was on WOR, right? The NWA we mentioned. And then even Florida Wrestling was on the Spanish channel.
I remember Dave LaGreca, our friend from Busted Open on Sirius XM radio. I forget the channel, but yeah, he'd always watch on like the UHF Spanish channel. Yeah. And then a friend of mine, it was I think a couple years later, this must be late 80s, early 90s, he had a satellite dish. So he got to see, Memphis and Continental and Portland. He'd tape it and we'd watch the tapes. It'd be like, Christmas morning every time he came over with a VCR tape.
I traded tapes for so long, and I remember the first thing I looked for was all the different territories I didn't get to see.
Yeah.
And I would get Georgia tapes, and I'd get Portland tapes, and I'd get Texas tapes.
Sure.
And, all these different things. It was just great to watch. And again, so many different styles, and we mentioned this too when we were talking with Steve Regal and Brian Blair about now obviously you see it coming back a little bit more because there's so much wrestling again.
Yeah.
But I think that's what I miss about the territories, was just the different styles of wrestling, the different again, we mentioned Bill Mercer. We were talking before we went on here, and Bill Mercer probably wasn't the greatest wrestling announcer, but he was still a great wrestling announcer,
He had a credibility because he actually was a legitimate broadcaster. Was he a sports guy, like the local TV station?
I think he did the Texas Range, and he did Texas wrestling for years.
Bill Mercer reminded me of the guy that did sports broadcasting on ABC's Wide World of Sports. Was it Bill McKay or Bob McKay?
Bob McKay, I think it was.
Yeah, he used to do Wide World of Sports, so he'd be doing the ski jumping, but then he'd also do the horse racing. He used to be on the sidelines of the Kentucky Derby or whatever big horse race was on. He'd do the Olympics when they were on ABC, do the skiing and the hockey.
Yeah.
So he reminded me of a legitimate sports announcer, which kind of gave world-class credibility. You need to believe the announcer who's telling you what's going on. It's the same thing now. When you watch a sporting event, the announcer's credibility comes into play. When you watch, who am I to judge, but I think now Joe Buck is a much better play-by-play announcer than he used to be years ago, because I think 10, 15, 20 years ago he was trying to be a comedian.
Yeah.
Where now he's just a sportscaster.
Yeah.
He tells you the story. He doesn't talk too much. He lets the game breathe.
Yeah.
But when you hear Joe Buck, it's a big event.
Yeah.
Joe Buck could be broadcasting a high school football game, and you would think, wow, this must be a big game because you hear that voice.
Yeah.
Because he has the credibility. The same with, if Jim Nance is doing the game or Al Michaels doing the game. So I think Bill Mercer brought that to world class, where it's wow, this is a legit guy telling you what's going on, not coming off like a used car salesman. And I think that helped.
I think so too, because World Class was one of the first shows that had the production values and the microphones by the ring, and they had
the microphones on the ring post. They had the cameraman on the ring.
Yeah.
They had the cameraman in the ring during the ring entrances and ring introductions, and then the cameraman would stay on the apron during the matches to take you in the ring. All of that was then, those ideas were borrowed or copied or stolen by the WWF and the NWA and the AWA. But a lot of that started with World Class.
Yeah, they did a lot of great stuff, and I think you look back, and I think it's why that show has so much appeal still, and besides the fact that it was exciting, hard-hitting wrestling, you had to be tough to make it in Texas.
Sure.
But the one thing
you had to be tough just to walk down the aisle through those fans. There were no guardrails back then. You just walked down through the people,
and that was it.
In the Sportatorium.
Tom Sawyer comes on. Forget it. You had to carry
Von Erich, or for 10 points, what was the theme song that Kevin Von Erich used?
Stranglehold.
Ted Nugent, baby!
Ted Nugent. And they would wait for the crescendo of the song.
Oh, my God.
And you'd be freaking out,
Stranglehold by Ted Nugent, used by Kevin Von Erich, might be the most underrated wrestler theme song of all time.
Oh, it was great. And and it was a fever pitch by the time Kevin made his way through the curtain, and you'd see them, and Kevin even mentions himself, like, the thing he loved about World Class was that the fans were so close, that the kids could come to the ring and get the autographs beforehand. You didn't really see that on a lot of the other wrestling shows.
It was different. Each territory offered something different, which was cool, because then, everybody had their favorite. You know, some of my friends like the AWA, some like the NWA, some like the WWF. But you still watched all of them. They all had something different, which was cool. Yeah. I mean, now if you put on current wrestling, you see gymnastics. It's like, oh, no, I don't like the WWF. I'm not going to watch that. It's just gymnastics. Okay, let me put on YouTube to see what's going on in this other big organization. Oh, they're just doing gymnastics too.
It's a different animal. Obviously, everything evolves, but I think that's why, especially with Wrestler Weekly, why we focus so much on the classic. Because I think there is so much good stuff out there that's still to be unearthed.
What's old is new. Every day on YouTube I stumble across, like you mentioned before, something from Portland or something from Memphis that, new upload that somebody, put up. And you can watch chronologically the old territory shows, and what's old is new again. I never saw it, so it's new to me if I see this, the feud between Playboy Buddy Rose and Roddy Piper from Oregon. Yeah. Or Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis tag team feud against Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne from Minnesota in the AWA. Yeah. You could watch it chronologically, follow the feud, follow the story, and it's new.
Yeah, and that's what I love doing. And like I on the network a lot of times, that's what I do. Like I go through Mid-South Wrestling, chronologically.
Oh, I left out Mid-South.
I know. I don't even know how I didn't even think about Mid-South.
San Francisco.
San Fran, yeah. I mean,
Southwest Championship Wrestling, which was on USA Network before the WWF.
It was the original wrestling show on the USA Network. I loved Southwest too. Joe Blanchard, right? It had such a good, fun, chaotic feel to it,
Championship Wrestling from Florida we left out. Oh, please forgive us. We can't mention everybody.
There's just so many good and that's the thing. There was so much good wrestling. Sure. And I think that's the thing. Like, if you go back, I miss seeing the ratings pages and like PWI and seeing all the territories. Oh man, like, Greg Valentine's now wrestling in Mid-Atlantic, or whatever, You'd see a guy, like you said, Buddy Rose, right, who was pretty much a jobber in the WWF, was this main event star in Portland and a tag team champion in the AWA. So it really, certain guys found certain niches depending on the promoter.
So underrated.
Oh, criminally underrated.
He was in the first match at the first WrestleMania.
The Executioner.
Buddy Rose.
Tito Santana.
Your friend and mine.
Also now a Jersey guy. The one thing I want to talk about real quick is, why do you think Pro Wrestling USA failed? Why did Pro Wrestling USA fail?
Well, Gary Michael Capetta, who's a good friend of ours, has told the story before, and he chronicled it in his book Body Slams, that the people from Crockett, David Crockett, would be trying to lure the guys from the AWA to come over to the NWA. And I'm sure that, secretly behind the scenes, Greg Gagne from the AWA was trying to get some of the NWA guys to come over there. They'd argue about, which match would go on first and which title match would go on last. And I guess that's why Continental dropped out and Memphis dropped out and WCCW dropped out, because they just couldn't agree on anything. And it just died. I think April 1980. It lasted about 2 years. Yeah. April 1986 was the last Pro Wrestling USA show at the Meadowlands. They only had about 5,000 people. And then a couple years later, end of 1988, AWA tried to do, they didn't call it Pro Wrestling USA, but it's when they did Super Clash 3 from Chicago, and they worked with those same groups again. They worked with World Class and Continental. And Super Clash 3 was a disaster. They had like 1,500 people in the UIC Pavilion in Chicago.
And you could see, like, the crowd. Like, it was just dark.
Pitch dark.
Yeah,
They couldn't decide on, who the champion was going to be at the end of the night. Yeah. Everybody argued. The World Class and Memphis people complained that Vern didn't pay them. But Vern claimed that they were supposed to be paid by their home promotion, not from the AWA. And they couldn't even work together to make that, successful. And it's, having more than one promoter or more than one organization try to work together never was successful in wrestling. No. It never worked.
I think a lot of times, too, because you're almost trying to protect your own, right?
Sure.
You have Jerry Lawler, who's the AWA champ at that time, Kerry Von Erich, who's the WCCW champ. How do you pick which one loses?
Well, I think it became confusing to the average fan or the casual fan, just like it was always confusing for me as a kid, and even, up until the past 10 years ago, where boxing, how many different initials were there and how many different champions were? Yeah. Now, I mean, boxing's finished. It's over.
Yeah.
Boxing has been replaced by UFC and mixed martial arts as far as popularity amongst men ages, 18 to 54. That demographic watches the UFC. Boxing is basically non-existent. And it was so confusing. He's a champion of, he's a WBC champion, but he's a champion of this.
Yeah.
And you'd always say, why don't they just fight each other, unify, have one world champion?
Yeah.
That was kind of the thing at, the AWA, or the Pro Wrestling USA, You'd have Rick Martel defending the AWA champion, then you'd have Ric Flair 2 matches later defending the NWA championship.
Who's the world champion?
Yeah, who's the world champion?
Yeah,
But then when the WCW went out of business and they were bought by WWF or WWE at the time, or whatever the heck they were called then, they couldn't even get that right. When they owned WCW, they couldn't get it right.
That's the worst. I can do a whole hour just talking.
It was the WWE, ECW, WCW, and
it was hard
under one owner. Yeah, under one company,
and couldn't do it.
And they still couldn't do it.
They couldn't.
An interpromotional storyline.
I literally was rubbing my eyes through that.
How do you mess? You know what? And the WWE, as far as ratings and attendance, since then has been down, continuously since 2001, 2002.
You're handed, and it's easy to go back now and be like an armchair booker, but you're handed the single greatest wrestling storyline
there was no logic
of all time.
They made everybody from WCW look like a jackass and incompetent. Of course it's not going to work.
Well, and and they killed it the minute they have Booker T, the world champion of WCW, come out, and The Rock doesn't even know who he is. And it was ill-fated, and we could talk about that forever.
Yeah. I'm more aggravated, Mike. Let me fire it up here.
Oh my God! Me and Scotty, for those of you who we talked about what we would do differently in WCW.
Oh my God!
We spent an hour on the phone talking about this is what I would have done. This is how I would have used Bret Hart. This is what I would have done with Sting Hogan. And obviously, egos and things get in the way. And again, like I said, it's easy for me to book now 20 years later. But even at the time, I remember being like, this show is awful.
It was awful.
It was awful.
To me, the only time WCW... Now, this is after they bought Crockett.
Yeah.
Because to me, I was a huge WWF fan. I was a WWF guy. But I love watching the NWA.
Oh, yeah.
I was like... This is real.
Yeah.
Because they're beating the hell out of each other.
Yeah.
But then, they get promoted to the WWF, and that's just a show.
Yeah.
They're cartoon characters, but they have to pay their dues first and, put their bodies on the line in the NWA. But when, WCW bought them, to me, the only time WCW was any good was after Jim Herd was gone. Mm-hmm. Bill Watts came in, kind of made it a little bit more serious, got rid of all the nonsense. But then even the beginning of when Eric Bischoff came in, because you look at 92, 93, 94, until Hogan came in, then it was over. They were never any good.
No.
You had Ravishing Rick Rude, Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Steve Austin, Paulie, Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, Ricky Steamboat, Brian Pillman, Steven Regal, Lord Steven Regal, Sting, Vader, Lex Luger, Harley Race, Nikita Koloff. I think Luger had just left by that point. The Steiners had left, but they were there in 92, so was Luger. You had Marcus Bagwell. You had Too Cold Scorpio. Amazing talent. Cactus Jack, Ron Simmons.
Orndorff comes in.
Medusa.
Oh, great. I love Medusa.
92, 93, 94, they were great. When Hogan came in, I know it...
Business-wise, it did.
Business-wise, it picked up. a little bit right at the beginning, but then 95, people were tired of Hulkamania. The Dungeon of Doom, it was all the WWF retread guys in.
Yeah.
The NWO was exciting for a month. It got everybody's attention. But then, there were like 400 people in the NWO.
Yeah.
You had Virgil in the NWO, the Big Show. Then you had like NWO Latina. You had NWO, Italy. You had NWO France.
I had my own NWO here.
You had your own. And it was a car, even when they were good and on top, they were a car crash.
Yeah.
To me, again, this is my opinion.
Yes.
They sucked. They were never any good, except 92, 93, 94, my opinion. After that, it was a disaster.
Yeah, I look at the stuff, and it's so funny because you look back now and you take a look, right? The good wrestling on a WCW show was all on the undercard.
Sure.
It was all the cruiserweight guys.
Jericho Benoit,
Guerrero, and Malenko, and all those guys. And then
Pillman was there for a
little bit. And then I recently watched the Hogan-Roddy Piper match.
I'm sorry.
For Starrcade 95.
So sorry.
What?
I don't know.
It was it was awful. It was just also, I choose not to remember Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan that way. But I look back at this, And
then the WWE, they never learned because they had them feud in 2003.
Awful.
I think it was Starrcade 97.
No, that's Sting Hogan.
96.
96, maybe you're right. Maybe 96.
96.
Yeah. You're right. Starrcade 96. 95
because Roddy was at WrestleMania in 96 against Goldust.
That's right. So Starrcade 96.
Horrendous match.
Terrible.
And the WWF put that match on pay-per-view in 2003.
It's horrible. That's the only time I think I've ever seen Piper put over Hogan.
I can't believe over the past 15, 16, 17 years how much WWE, how many mistakes they've made by not learning from history and the mistakes that were made in WCW. Well, it's unbelievable.
Oh, like, hey, let's go to a 3-hour format every Monday.
Unbelievable. Those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yep.
And that's what they do. I mean, the WWE lost me as a fan. I mean, more than 10 years. Yeah. I mean, the last show I watched was January 2010 when Bret Hart came back to the WWF and Shawn Michaels was on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was it. That was the last show I watched. The only other time it was ever on my screen since then was April 2014 when the Ultimate Warrior was on Raw.
Yeah.
That was it. They lost me as a fan a long time ago because I hated Nitro and Thunder in like 98, 99, 2000, 2001. And that's what the WWF was becoming. It was just, oh my God, it's Nitro and Thunder all over again.
Yeah, and so some of the last Nitros and Thunders were amongst the worst wrestling I've ever seen. I tried to rewatch.
What's wrong with you? Why would you punish yourself like that?
Because, sometimes with age, you're like, maybe it wasn't that bad.
No, it was bad. I got news for you.
It was that bad. I had to turn it off, and it was like, and no offense to these guys, but it was like Lash LaRue and the artist formerly known as Prince Iaukea, and I couldn't. It was terrible.
Jeez.
It was awful. I tried.
Are you into self-harm?
I'm cursed as an eternal optimist, and it just didn't do it.
And even that made you pessimistic. Going back and watching,
it was awful. Even me, the most positive guy in the world. So I want to close this out by talking about some good wrestling, some good old-fashioned wrestling. IWF Loud and Proud 22. I got the chance to be a part of 21 last year. It was awesome. It took me back to the wrestling that we grew up on, the wrestling that we were talking about today here on the show. Kevin, tell us a little bit about the event, what it benefits, who's going to be there, and why you should make your way to Nutley, New Jersey and attend this show.
It's pro wrestling like it should be. 2.5 hours of action, 7 matches, no talking, nobody on the microphone, good wrestling, some great old school legends. We have WWE Hall of Famer Tito Santana. We have WWE legend B. Brian Blair from the Killer Bees, a previous guest here on Wrestler Weekly. We have former WWE light heavyweight champion, the man, the myth. He's bringing the power. He's bringing the muscle. Gilbert.
I hope that there's the pyro.
Oh, there's gonna be. Are you kidding? This is Gilbert.
That's what I come
right
here for.
Now. In North Jersey, they're getting the permits from the fire department. For the pyro explosion.
That is what I want.
What's going to happen when Gilbert comes out?
I'm going to have to. I stand by the entrance ramp too, so I got to watch.
You better watch. You better be wearing fire retardant clothing. Guest ring announcer, WWE and WCW ring announcing legend Gary Michael Capetta will be there again.
Very good guy.
It's our 22nd annual Loud and Proud. For IWF Wrestling in Nutley, New Jersey, which is right by MetLife Stadium in the Meadowlands. So the week before, you could go and watch WrestleMania and bitch and complain about sitting through an awful 7-hour show, which is what everybody does at every WWE wrestling event these days.
There's no happy fans anymore. In
my feed, anytime anybody watches Raw or SmackDown or there's a pay-per-view or something going on, all everybody does is complain.
Yep.
So go be aggravated by WrestleMania and then come watch wrestling the way it should be. So every spring, the IWF, when we do our anniversary show, we do it. In the past, we travel to a different city or town in New Jersey to do our anniversary show to raise funds for a different charity. So the past 8 years, we've done a fundraiser at the Nutley Recreation Center to benefit American Cancer Society and Relay for Life. So this April 13th, 2019, a Saturday night, is our 22nd Spring Spectacular event and our 8th year in a row where we will be raising funds for American Cancer Society. So it's for a great cause, some great wrestling. You have the top IWF graduates and wrestlers will be there, along with the 4 Hall of Famers and legends will be there. And we hope you're there, too, to come and join us for a night of good old-fashioned, old-school wrestling. Matches can't be stopped for a bloody nose. The matches will continue. You're not going to pay money for a ticket to see people talk and have them in the ring, for 30 minutes to talk about what's going to happen. No. 7:35, when the lights go down, the matches start, and we're going to wrestle for 2.5 hours. And it's going to be a great night, and we're excited to have the legends with us. We love to honor the legends, just like Wrestler Weekly does, and just like IWF does. If it wasn't for the legends and those guys that we grew up watching, we wouldn't be here. I remember going to see Gary Michael Capetta introduce the WWF shows at the Meadowlands, the Pro Wrestling USA shows at the Meadowlands, and then later the WCW wrestling events after Turner purchased them from Crockett. He was the ring announcer for WCW. So I grew up, Gary Michael Capetta was the voice. He was my soundtrack to wrestling, so when I hear that voice, it takes me back to those days. And I remember going to see Tito Santana wrestle at the Meadowlands and B. Brian Blair wrestle at the Meadowlands and also Madison Square Garden, Nassau Coliseum. So they were, amazing legends, especially here in the Northeast. So fans can come out. They can. We have the All Access Fan Fest before the show where you could get a picture taken or autograph with the legend and then get to see them do their thing that night.
So it's going to be an incredible show. We definitely want you to attend. And again, it benefiting such a good and worthy cause just makes it all the more. Great wrestling. Like I said, when I went last year, got to be a part of it. It was incredible. It blew me away. And you don't want to miss this event.
Sure.
For anybody who's interested, it's at IWF Wrestling, right? Or is it Wrestling IWF?
Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube is at Wrestling IWF, and the website is campiwf.com. And this is actually like a legitimate pro wrestling fundraiser, unlike 98% of independent wrestling events where they say, oh, it's going to benefit this charity, and they give like 50 cents to the charity. This, we pay for the cost of the event, and then the rest goes to the charity. So in the past 7 years, we've raised almost $30,000 for American Cancer Society. It's about $4,000 to $5,000 per event that we donate. Again, after we pay the cost of the talent, the advertising, the promotion, lighting and sound, we donate all of the money to American Cancer Society. So this is a legitimate pro wrestling fundraiser, which is great, which is the way it should be. So we're excited to have you with us again coming up this spring, Mike, as well as the Legends and Hall of Famers.
Well, we're going to have a great time. Thank you guys again. Episode 5.
Wait, we're done? I just got started. When we get together to talk old school pro wrestling, Mike, it's usually like 4 hours we talk. What's this 45-minute stuff? You know what? We're going to have to do it again.
We are going to have to do it again. So you'll see Kevin back this season for sure because this was fun. And there was
I'm not leaving until I'm back on. So all the guests you have, I'm going to be sitting in the corner listening until you're ready to have me back on.
I'm down with that. Hopefully you're down with that too. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good night.